It was April 5th, 1909, when a modest front page of the Arizona Gazette carried a headline unlike anything else in American journalism that year. At a time when the nation was still obsessed with the Wright brothers' flights, the Alaska gold rush, and the growing power of industry, this article whispered something entirely different, something older, deeper, and far more dangerous to the official story of our past. The ones history books never tell fascinate you. Make sure you're subscribed to Dust Files with the bell on. That way you won't miss the next piece of the puzzle. The piece claimed that an expedition, led by a man identified only as Professor S.A. Jordan and financed by the Smithsonian Institution, had stumbled upon something astonishing in the remote recesses of the Grand Canyon. Not a single relic, not a buried tomb, but an entire underground city, stretching for miles beneath the ancient rock. According to the article, the entrance was halfway up a sheer cliff face, impossible to reach without specialized climbing equipment. Once inside, the explorers found long corridors chiseled into the sandstone, branching into hundreds of rooms. In those rooms were artifacts that shouldn't have existed on the North American continent. Bronze tools, stone tablets covered in mysterious symbols, and walls etched with hieroglyphics that mirrored those of ancient Egypt. There were mummies, two not wrapped like the ones in Cairo's museums, but preserved in a way that seemed both familiar and alien. The bodies were tall, their skulls elongated, their features described as Oriental in some passages and distinctly Egyptian in others. This wasn't just a stray burial chamber. The article spoke of a complex that could house over 50,000 people, a subterranean metropolis carved by hands unknown for the readers of 1909. This was not merely archaeology. It was heresy, if the account was true. It shattered the idea that the ancient civilizations of the Old World and the New World had never crossed paths. It suggested transoceanic voyages thousands of years before Columbus, and the possibility of a cultural network that stretched from the Nile to the Colorado River. The Gazette described vaults filled with weaponry, statues of strange deities, and one room containing what the reporter called a Buddhist-like idol, seated cross-legged in silent meditation. There were even claims of intricate irrigation systems, hinting that whoever had built this place had not only mastered architecture, but had also thrived in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. And yet, as the story unfolded, it carried a subtle undertone, a reminder that the location was not to be visited and that the expedition was under official oversight. The article noted that Professor Jordan was continuing work under the direction of the Smithsonian, with an implication that findings would be reported in due course. But no such report ever came, even in 1909. Readers might have suspected exaggeration, or even fabrication. Newspapers of the era were prone to sensationalism. But there was something about this piece, the specificity of names, the technical descriptions of the tunnels, the strange combination of Egyptian, Asian, and Native American cultural references that set it apart from the usual tall tales. It read less like a hoax and more like a field report accidentally released to the public. What makes this article more than just a curiosity from a century ago is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. There was no follow-up, no Smithsonian press release, no academic debate. The story simply vanished, swallowed by silence. If you tried to track down the people involved, you hit walls. Professor S.A. Jordan appears nowhere else in academic history. The supposed co-discoverer, G.E. Kincaid, is mentioned only in connection with this one story. The Smithsonian, when contacted decades later, flatly denied having any records of the expedition, the men, or the artifacts. And yet, the Gazette wasn't the only whisper. Over the decades, scattered rumors emerged from hikers, river guides, and locals, people who claimed to have seen sealed cave entrances in the same region. Others spoke of areas that had suddenly been closed to the public, with no entry signs and armed park rangers stationed nearby. Whether the article was a journalist's elaborate fiction, a garbled retelling of a real but misunderstood find, or a leak of something far more significant, it set in motion a mystery that has endured for over a century, a mystery in which the absence of evidence feels almost like evidence itself, because if this underground city was real, and if it truly held artifacts that didn't belong on this continent, then the story didn't just disappear. It was buried, sealed away like the tunnels themselves, waiting for someone to break it open again. If the Arizona Gazette's 1909 article was a spark, the supposed involvement of the Smithsonian was the Smithsonian Institution, the United States' most prestigious cultural and scientific establishment, was not merely a museum, but a gatekeeper of history. For its name to appear in connection with a lost underground city in the Grand Canyon lent instant credibility, or at least, it seemed to the article's language was explicit. The expedition was under the direction of the Smithsonian. This wasn't hearsay or an anonymous rumor. The paper named Professor S.A. Jordan as the supervising archaeologist and G.E. Kincaid as the explorer who first discovered the cave entrance while traveling down the Colorado River. Yet when modern researchers, journalists, and amateur historians began digging, something strange happened. Every trail led to silence. The Smithsonian's official archives, meticulously maintained for over a century, have no mention of Professor Jordan. No expedition logs, no photographs, no field notes, no crates of artifacts matching the description from 1909 G.E. Kincaid, supposedly a veteran of the U.S. Army and an experienced explorer, appears nowhere in any military or census records under that name. It's as if both men sprang into existence for a single story and then vanished in the 1990s. Author and researcher David Hatcher Childress contacted the Smithsonian directly, asking about the alleged discovery. The institution's response was short, cold, and final. We have no records or evidence of any such find. The story is not true. Others who pressed further received nearly identical replies. Inquiries were treated as if they were asking about folklore, or worse, as if they were inconveniences to be dismissed without elaboration. But here's where the tension grows. The Smithsonian has been accused before of quietly disposing of artifacts that challenge the accepted narrative of history whistleblowers. Most famously, a man claiming to be a former Smithsonian curator in the early 20th century have told stories of ancient skeletal remains, some of them belonging to giants, being confiscated and destroyed officially. The institution denies any such practices unofficially. The stories persist like ghostly fingerprints smudged across the pages of history. Could the Grand Canyon discovery have been subject to the same fate? Skeptics argue that the Gazette story was nothing more than an imaginative work of frontier-era journalism, meant to entertain rather than inform. They point out that the paper had a reputation for the occasional tall tale, but even this explanation has cracks. The Gazette article is remarkably detailed in its measurements, room layouts, and cultural descriptions. If fabricated, it was a fabrication of unusual sophistication, one that required deep knowledge of both ancient Egyptian and Asian art forms, as well as the geology of the Grand Canyon. Then there is the question of access. Much of the area described in the Fiat 1909 report is today part of the off-limits zone of the Grand Canyon National Park. Certain cliff faces inside canyons are marked as restricted, patrolled by park rangers, and in some cases, monitored remotely, officially. This is for safety and environmental preservation, but for those familiar with the article, it feels eerily like a quarantine, a cordon around the past. The Smithsonian's denial might have been enough to kill the story for most people, but for others, it had the opposite effect after all. Why would the nation's leading scientific body feel the need to issue such a blunt dismissal over an old newspaper clipping, unless there was something worth denying? Independent researchers began combing through old river maps, expedition journals, and even aerial photographs of the canyon's remote regions. A few claimed to have spotted what looked like sealed entrances, high in the cliffs, dark ovals bricked over or collapsed, their edges too symmetrical to be natural. These sightings were never officially confirmed, but they poured fuel on the theory that the Smithsonian or perhaps another government entity had taken control of the site in 1909, sealed it, and erased all records. If true, this wouldn't be an isolated incident. Historical archives are littered with stories and convenient discoveries that simply vanished. Stone tablets found in the American Midwest with inscriptions that didn't match any known indigenous language. Skeletons far larger than average, spirited away after brief newspaper coverage. Ancient maps showing coastlines as they existed before the last ice age in nearly every case. Institutions like the Smithsonian or government agencies stepped in and the trail went cold. And if the Smithsonian truly had nothing to hide, why does the absence of evidence feel so deliberate? Why do the names and records vanish so cleanly, as if scrubbed from existence? Before the Grand Canyon became the postcard-perfect emblem of America's natural wonders, it was something very different, a wild, untamed frontier that drew miners, surveyors, and military cartographers like moths to a flame. The sheer scale of the canyon, with its hidden ledges and labyrinth of side gorges, made it both a treasure trove and a dangerous enigma. In the late 1800s, mining companies saw the canyon not as a tourist destination, but as a resource vault. Prospectors hunted for copper, silver, and asbestos, carving primitive trails into cliff faces and blasting narrow tunnels into the rock. Small camps formed along the riverbanks, many of which were later abandoned without explanation. Newspaper reports from the era speak of promising strikes, followed abruptly by silence, as if the ventures had been suddenly halted or swallowed by the canyon itself. Alongside the miners came the military. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted detailed surveys of the canyon's geography, mapping routes for potential transport corridors. These early maps, now archived in scattered collections, are strangely inconsistent. Certain sections are drawn with obsessive precision, while others are left as vague, empty spaces. Entire tributary systems appear on some maps, only to vanish on later editions. By the early 1900s, the canyon was drawing the attention of scientists and explorers from across the country. Geological teams from universities and government agencies arrived to study the rock strata, the fossils, and the ancient ruins left behind by the ancestral pueblones. Many of these expeditions published detailed field reports, but others left only fragments of their work in obscure journals or personal letters. It is within this chaotic blend of activity mining, mapping, and sporadic science that the Arizona Gazette's 1909 story landed. It described an immense underground city, rich with artifacts of a culture seemingly out of place in the American Southwest. Whether true or false, the timing was curious. Within a decade of that publication, the landscape of the canyon's governance would shift dramatically. In 1919, the Grand Canyon officially became a national park. The decision was framed as a triumph of conservation, ensuring the canyon's beauty would be preserved for future generations. But the designation also came with new rules, strict ones. Entire stretches of the inner canyon were declared off-limits to the public. Access to certain cliff faces, caves, and plateaus was not just discouraged, but legally prohibited. Park rangers were granted authority to remove trespassers and restrict entry to sensitive zones. Some of these closures made sense for safety or ecological reasons, but others were harder to explain. Certain areas aligned with the descriptions in the 1909 article: towering cliff faces on the north side, sheer rock walls dotted with inaccessible alcoves, were now locked behind layers of red tape. Trails that once led toward these zones were erased from official maps or rerouted. Entirely oral accounts from locals who lived near the canyon's rim tell of small crews, unmarked except for their government-issued equipment, operating in these restricted regions in the years following the park's establishment. Supplies were hauled in under cover of darkness. Materials were lowered by rope. Then, without fanfare, the crews would vanish and the area would be placed under permanent closure. It is here that the pattern begins to emerge. A transition from open exploration to controlled access. What was once a place where miners could chip away at the rock and riverboats could pass freely became a site. Guarded as tightly as a vault, archival photographs from the canyon's pre-park years reveal structures and features that no longer exist. Carved openings in cliff faces, symmetrical enough to raise questions. Dark voids in the rock that appear to have been filled or collapsed. Stone walls perched on impossible ledges. Today, these details are absent from guidebooks, and many are physically unreachable without specialized climbing gear and a permit that, for most applicants, will never be approved. By the time the Grand Canyon became a protected landmark, its story had been rewritten. The official narrative was now one of natural beauty and geological grandeur. The other story, the one hinted at by the Arizona Gazette, faded into rumor, preserved only by those who suspected there was more to the closures than public safety or conservation. What remains undeniable is that the years between the late 1800s and 1919 were a time of intense, sometimes undocumented activity in the canyon. Mines were opened and abandoned, surveys were drawn and then altered. And somewhere in that narrow window, if the 1909 account is to be believed, a discovery was made that would have demanded secrecy on a national scale. The shift from a land of open opportunity to one of locked gates and hidden records didn't happen by accident. It happened quickly, deliberately, and with a precision that suggests the canyon was not simply being preserved, it was being managed. And in the next chapter, the management of the canyon's secrets would extend far beyond mere legal boundaries into the creation of an invisible map, one that marked the places the public was never meant to see. In the decades following the Grand Canyon's transformation into a national park, its cliffs and ravines became more than a wonder of nature. They became a labyrinth with walls, not walls of stone, but walls of silence. And within that silence, certain places began to take on an almost mythical status among locals and seasoned explorers. The sealed caves accounts stretch back to the 1930s, when seasoned river runners spoke of passing sheer cliff faces pockmarked with dark, yawning voids, some natural, others disturbingly symmetrical. These openings, set high above the river or deep along lesser-known trails, appeared for a time and then years later seemed to vanish. Where a black mouth in the rock once hinted at vast internal chambers, there would be only rubble, as though the cliff itself had been deliberately collapsed by the mid-20th century. The pattern became harder to dismiss as coincidence. Hikers who wandered off established trails and were willing to risk the legal penalties told of encountering cave mouths blocked by heavy steel doors. The doors were thick, weathered, and fitted perfectly into the jagged stone, some secured with padlocks, so corroded they looked as if they had been placed there decades earlier. In other cases, the entrances were walled with stacked stone, the seams filled with mortar to match the surrounding cliff face, blending almost perfectly with the natural rock. None of these features appear on official park maps. In fact, many of the locations where they were once reported are absent from public topographical records altogether. Where a contour map from the 1910s or 1920s might show a depression or side canyon, modern charts present a smooth, featureless expanse. The omissions are subtle, the kind of changes only noticed when old and new documents are laid side by side. For those who know the story of the 1909 Arizona Gazette report, the implications are striking. The article's descriptions of an underground network, carved directly into the cliff walls, match eerily with the placement of these sealed sites in more than one instance. Hand-drawn sketches from early 20th century explorers, recovered from private collections or small-town archives, line up almost exactly with the modern locations of reported blockages. One particularly compelling case comes from the north side of the canyon, in a remote section rarely visited even by experienced climbers. In the 1960s, a pair of amateur archaeologists documented a massive cave mouth, its entrance nearly 40 feet across. Inside, they claimed, the passage descended at a steep angle before opening into a chamber with smooth, tool-marked walls. On a return visit several years later, They found the entrance completely sealed by a wall of rock and cement, the surface coated in dust and debris, as if to suggest it had never been there at all. Similar stories circulate about other sealed openings, some located on narrow ledges accessible only by rope, others hidden inside canyons far from tourist trails. In each case, the result is the same: an entry point, once visible, is now closed, often in a manner too precise and uniform to be the work of natural erosion, while official explanations lean toward safety concerns, geological instability, or preservation of fragile environments. The frequency and consistency of these closures tell another story. The sealing is not random, and it is not new. Some of the most remote and inaccessible sites, the very places where casual visitors would never wander, have been blocked off just as thoroughly as those near established routes. Even more unsettling are the occasional fleeting reports from those who have stumbled upon modern activity at these sites. Campers have described hearing the echo of drilling in distant cliffs during the dead of night, or spotting lights moving in places with no nearby trails. The activity is quiet, controlled, and never acknowledged piece by piece. The image sharpens. The Grand Canyon is not merely a protected natural wonder. It is a vault, with its contents walled away behind barriers of steel, stone, and omission. And while some of these entrances may lead to nothing more than shallow chambers or hazardous voids, others, based on the alignments with old sketches and descriptions, may be connected to something far larger. These sealed caves exist not in isolation, but in a pattern that mirrors the path described in 1909, when an alleged Smithsonian-backed expedition mapped an underground world of chambers, tunnels, and artifacts that should not have existed in the American Southwest. That pattern still lies across the canyon today, etched into its hidden walls, waiting for anyone willing to look beyond the maps they are allowed to see. That pattern begins to come into focus, and with it, the possibility that what was sealed away in the canyon's cliffs was not just stone, but an entire piece of history. The Grand Canyon, in its raw immensity, appears to be a monument shaped entirely by the patient hand of nature. Yet, if the sealed caves and hidden passages are what some claim them to be, then these cliffs are not simply walls of stone, they are walls of history, concealing the legacy of builders whose identities have been erased. Theories of who could have carved a city into the canyon's heart span centuries of speculation. The most widely circulated begin with a lost pre-Columbian civilization, one that may have flourished in the American Southwest long before European contact. Archaeological evidence from other parts of North America has shown that ancient cultures were capable of monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, and long-distance trade. If such a people had settled deep within the canyon, the remoteness of the location might have allowed their works to remain hidden from the wider world. Then there is the far more controversial notion of transoceanic contact, the idea that peoples from distant lands reached the Americas long before Columbus. The 1909 Gazette account described artifacts that bore the hallmarks of Egyptian and Asian influence: statues of deities, inscriptions in hieroglyphic form, and architectural elements reminiscent of the Nile's great temples. These details, if true, imply either direct contact between the Old World and the American Southwest, or a shared inheritance from an even older, unknown source. Some historians dismiss this as romantic fantasy, yet the trade winds, ocean currents, and evidence of ancient seafaring make such journeys at least physically possible. Fragments of botanical evidence. Old World plants in pre-Columbian contexts have fueled the belief that the oceans were not impassable barriers, but ancient highways. If ships crossed the Atlantic or Pacific thousands of years ago, the deep, defensible chambers of the Grand Canyon would have offered an ideal refuge for a people seeking to preserve their traditions far from their homeland. But deeper still lies a third theory, one that shifts the timeline entirely. According to this view, the builders were neither strictly native nor foreign. They were survivors of a far older, advanced culture that existed before the end of the last ice age, when the world was a different place entirely. In this telling, the canyon city was not merely a settlement, but part of a network of outposts across the globe, linked by shared architectural principles and astronomical alignments. Evidence of such alignments has been found in stone structures on every continent. And if the canyon site shares these traits, it would place its origins in a forgotten epoch of human history. Native American oral traditions add another layer to the mystery among certain tribes. There are stories of people from the East who once lived in the canyon not as intruders, but as an established presence. Some accounts describe these people as master stoneworkers and keepers of ancient knowledge, who vanished when great changes came to the land. Others speak of beings who emerged from the earth itself, as if the canyon's depths were both a home and a place of origin. While such narratives are often interpreted symbolically, they align with the idea that the canyon once housed an enduring, sophisticated society taken together. These threads form a tapestry that challenges conventional history. They suggest that the Grand Canyon was more than a geological marvel. It was a cultural crossroads, a hidden stronghold, and perhaps even a repository for knowledge too valuable or too dangerous to be left in the open. The sealing of caves, the removal of certain map details, and the quiet absence of official acknowledgement begin to make more sense in this light. The builders, whoever they were, left no public record. Their names, languages, and beliefs have been absorbed into the vast silence of the stone. Yet their possible works, the tunnels, chambers, and artifacts whispered about for more than a century, still haunt the canyon's shadowed cliffs. And if they were part of a civilization capable of such feats, then the truth of their existence would not simply expand our understanding of history, it would shatter it. What remains now is a network of clues, some carved in the rock, others hidden in archives or passed down through generations in guarded stories, revealing patterns and alignments that suggest the canyon's mysteries are not isolated anomalies, but fragments of a vast, interconnected design. The story of the Grand Canyon's hidden city is not just defined by what has been claimed, it is equally shaped by what cannot be found. This absence is not the natural void of forgotten history. It feels, in many ways, like a carefully pruned silence. Every trail that might lead to answers seems to collapse into dead ends, not because no one has searched, but because the evidence itself appears to have been methodically erased. Freedom of Information Act requests for Smithsonian expedition records from the early 20th century yield nothing relevant, not even a hint of misfiled data, names from the original article, such as Professor Kincaid, produced no trace in census documents, academic rosters, or passenger manifests. It is as if he never existed anywhere except in that single, controversial publication, the few historical photographs of the canyon that might show. Unusual cave entrances have either been recatalogued under vague labels or are simply gone. Archivists say that collections are always in flux, but the missing images share a strange coincidence. Many were reportedly taken in the very regions connected to the 1909 story. Even modern tools offer no clear path forward. Coordinates shared in online forums over the years, locations where hikers claim to have seen. Sealed openings now show blurred textures on public satellite imagery. Some are marked only by indistinct smudges of beige and brown. As if the canyon walls there have been digitally softened into anonymity when compared to older satellite archives. Subtle differences appear. Rock shadows that once suggested depth now appear flatter, less defined. The pattern extends beyond the canyon. Similar anomalies exist in other locations tied to archaeological controversy. Areas where theories challenge the accepted narrative, it is as if the landscape itself is being rewritten, pixel by pixel, to conform to a version of history considered safe. For researchers, this creates an eerie feedback loop. The harder one looks for proof, the more the gaps seem to widen. Newspaper archives, once accessible without restriction, are suddenly locked behind paywalls or unavailable due to preservation status. Old maps are digitized with areas missing. As if the original sheets were damaged, yet the omissions align too precisely with disputed zones to feel accidental. To the casual observer, this might sound like coincidence. To the persistent investigator, it feels like a campaign of quiet removal. The absences line up too neatly, forming a shadow outline where the truth should be. This outline is not carved in stone, but in what is missing: the vanished photographs, the inaccessible records, the blurred pixels. There is a chilling psychology to this kind of silence. When a story is ridiculed or loudly denied, it remains alive through debate. But when it is simply erased, when there is nothing left to hold, quote, or display, the story begins to die, not with a bang, but with a slow, invisible suffocation. The canyon itself remains unchanged, but the paper and digital trails that might prove its deeper history dissolve into nothingness, and yet, paradoxically, this void may be the most compelling clue of all. True fabrications tend to leave a trail of invention, conflicting testimonies, physical artifacts placed without care, evidence that can be torn apart by scrutiny. What we see here is something different, a history that has been vacuumed clean. The vacuum speaks not through what it contains, but through the unsettling precision of what it omits. From a certain angle, the canyon becomes less a natural wonder and more a vault, not the kind sealed by doors and locks, but by the absence of what should be there. And once you recognize the pattern, you begin to see its shape everywhere. Slyly, the focus will shift from erasure to what persists, the fragments that escape this quiet purge. Because while much has been removed, a handful of surviving clues suggest that the canyon's hidden history is not gone entirely, just hidden in places where most will never think to look. The Grand Canyon's secrets are not confined to the tale of a lost city. Scattered across its vast expanse are smaller enigmas, fragments of the past, that don't fit neatly into the official narrative. Each one a thread that, if pulled, could unravel something far greater. On remote canyon walls, far from the well-trodden tourist paths, petroglyphs depict animals that should not be here: long-necked creatures resembling giraffes, elephants with curling tusks, even what appear to be crocodiles or alligators. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to artistic imagination or travelers' tales passed through indigenous cultures. But the precision of the forms is unsettling. The ancient artists didn't just suggest these creatures, they etched them with anatomical accuracy, as if they had been seen firsthand. In certain side canyons, stacked stone towers rise in odd isolation. Their purpose unknown, they are too small to be defensive structures, too deliberately engineered to be random rockfalls. The stones are interlocked without mortar, balanced in ways that defy casual construction. Some align with prominent ridge lines. Others face toward the horizon, where the sun rises on the summer solstice. These alignments are not approximate, they are precise, the kind of precision that requires generations of observation and intentional design. Along the canyon rim, researchers have mapped peculiar geometric formations: low, circular mounds of stone that mirror earthworks found thousands of miles away in the Mississippi Valley. Suggestion of cultural connection between such distant peoples challenges the accepted boundaries of pre-Columbian America. In caves that remain accessible, unusual artifacts sometimes emerge. Finely polished stones drilled with perfect holes, fragments of woven textiles that seem older than their carbon dates suggest, and pictographs in red and yellow ochre that show symbols with no match in the known lexicon of Southwest rock art. Each find is quietly cataloged, rarely publicized, and often locked away in regional archives where they gather dust, unstudied. Then there is the phenomenon of acoustic hotspots, locations deep in the canyon where a single word or clap echoes back not once, but multiple times, shifting in pitch as if resonating through unseen chambers. Hikers who stumble upon these spots describe the sensation as unnerving, almost as if the rock itself is listening. In several cases, these acoustically unique areas correspond with regions marked as restricted on climbing maps, taken separately. These mysteries could be dismissed as curiosities together. They form a mosaic, a quiet reminder that the canyon has never fully yielded its past. The presence of solstice markers and precise astronomical alignments hints at a people who are not only surviving here, but thriving, mapping the heavens and embedding that knowledge into stone. The petroglyphs of foreign animals suggest either travel to distant lands or a world very different from the one we know. When climates and migration patterns blurred the boundaries of continents, it is in these side mysteries that the larger story gains depth. They show that the Grand Canyon's enigma is not built on a single controversial article from 1909, but on a web of evidence scattered, incomplete, yet consistent in its implication that this place was far more than a geographic wonder. It was a hub, a meeting point, perhaps even a sanctuary for knowledge. The canyon's scale makes these clues easy to overlook. They exist in the blind spots between hiking trails, in the sheer walls no one climbs, and in the shadows cast by the shifting sun. They are pieces of a puzzle that no institution has publicly acknowledged assembling, but their presence keeps the mystery alive, whispering that whatever was once here was significant enough to leave traces across centuries, even if its core has been buried or hidden entirely. From these small surviving anomalies to the unsettling question of what might happen if the full truth were brought into the light, not just for the canyon, but for history as a whole. History is not simply a record of the past. It is a carefully maintained narrative. Those who shape it decide what becomes common knowledge and knowledge. What slips into obscurity. If the Grand Canyon once housed a vast underground city, the choice to erase it would not be made lightly. The reasons for such a decision are never as simple as protecting artifacts. They are bound to power, control, and the preservation of certain worldviews. Consider the weight of such a revelation, a confirmed connection between an ancient, technologically skilled culture in the heart of North America and civilizations of the Old World. Would disrupt centuries of archaeological consensus. It would upend the tidy progression taught in textbooks, forcing a reassessment of migration theories, cultural isolationism, and the development of human complexity for institutions built on the authority of their version of history. This kind of shift would mean more than embarrassment. It would mean losing control over the narrative itself. Religious orthodoxy would also feel the tremor. A site that predates accepted timelines could challenge long-held chronologies embedded in faith traditions. The origin stories that anchor entire cultures might suddenly be competing with tangible, irrefutable evidence of a past that doesn't fit their framework. Such contradictions are not easily absorbed into belief systems. They fracture them. National security interests may also be in play. An underground complex in a location as strategically important as the Grand Canyon could hold more than relics. It could conceal vast natural resources, hidden waterways, or even access to geological formations of rare value. In the early 20th century, control over such a site would have been fiercely guarded, especially if it held any material that could be exploited in wartime or industrial development. A public frenzy could complicate that control, drawing eyes where secrecy was preferred. There is also the matter of treasure. If the 1909 Arizona Gazette account was even partially true, the city contained gold, artifacts of craftsmanship unlike anything in the region, and possibly ancient manuscripts. For powerful private interests or government entities, the wealth represented by such a cache would be reason enough to ensure it never became common knowledge. Public discovery would mean legal disputes, claims from multiple nations, and inevitable looting. Secrecy ensures possession without interference in many ways. Suppression itself becomes a kind of asset. The fewer who know, the easier it is to preserve the integrity or exclusivity of what has been found. Over time, the absence of evidence becomes its own camouflage. New generations grow up unaware there was ever anything to hide, and the initial event fades from the collective memory, surviving only in fragments. A newspaper clipping, an obscure reference, a whispered story. Patterns of similar concealment appear across history. Certain shipwrecks, once rumored to hold priceless artifacts, vanish from records after government intervention. Ancient ruins in politically unstable regions are quietly mapped, then sealed off under the guise of preservation, even in the age of digital access. High-resolution satellite images are occasionally blurred, downgraded, or replaced, leaving only the hint that something once drew too much attention. The canyon story fits seamlessly into this established pattern. The cost of truth is often weighed against the stability of the present. For those in power, stability usually wins. What the public never learns cannot disrupt markets, divide communities, or challenge authority. An underground city, if real, is not just a curiosity. It is a disruptive force. It is an anchor point for rewriting the human story. And once such an anchor is placed, the entire map of our understanding must shift to keep the map as it is. The anchor must remain invisible, and so the city, if it exists, stays buried beneath layers of stone and silence, guarded by official denial and the natural difficulty of the terrain. The canyon's grandeur becomes its own disguise, drawing millions of eyes to its surface while keeping its depths undisturbed by now. The trail in this story has narrowed to a razor's edge. Every fragment from the 1909 article to modern accounts of sealed caves points toward a possibility that cannot be publicly confirmed without unraveling more than one thread of history. The truth, if it lies in the shadows of those cliffs, is locked behind barriers far stronger than steel doors. The collective will of those who stand to gain more from secrecy than revelation. The stage is now set for the finale, not to prove the city's existence beyond doubt, but to confront the deeper reality. What happens when the possibility alone is powerful enough to be hidden? The Grand Canyon stretches for over 200 miles, but not every footstep is welcome for most visitors. The canyon is a place of awe and wonder, open to hiking trails, guided tours, and breathtaking vistas. But woven into its vastness are zones where the rules change, where the law doesn't simply discourage entry, it forbids it. Along the north side of the canyon, in a section far from the main tourist routes, lies an area that maps label vaguely, if at all. Here, the terrain is not only treacherous, but also wrapped in layers of regulation. Hiking permits are denied without explanation. Drone flights, even for licensed operators, are categorically rejected. Small aircraft pilots know to avoid certain corridors or risk federal penalties. In an era when almost anywhere on Earth can be captured by satellite, here the digital clarity seems to falter. Blurred patches, older image tiles, or lighting conditions that never quite reveal the details. These restrictions are often justified in official terms: environmental protection, sacred tribal land, or safety concerns due to unstable geology. All are valid reasons, but in this particular section, the boundaries are tighter than logic seems to demand. Entire valleys are marked off-limits, with buffer zones extending far beyond any fragile cliff face or nesting ground. It is protection with a wide berth, as if the intent is not simply to guard a spot, but to keep eyes away from a much larger footprint park rangers and federal officers patrol these edges more actively than the surrounding wilderness. Reports from hikers who strayed too far tell of quick, decisive interventions, sometimes before they were even aware they'd crossed into a restricted zone in the age of GPS. Such precision in enforcement is no accident. It suggests a constant awareness of movement in and out, as though this patch of land is under surveillance. Even aerial exploration is limited. Photographers who have tried to capture high-resolution imagery of the region find their requests mired in red tape or outright ignored. Some who attempted unauthorized overflights speak of being shadowed by aircraft until they turned away. While such measures might be explained as standard security for protected lands, the intensity here feels different, sharper, more deliberate. The most curious alignment is geographic. This forbidden zone overlaps almost perfectly with the coordinates described in the 1909 Arizona Gazette article. The very area where the alleged underground city was said to lie. That convergence may be coincidence, but in the world of hidden histories, Coincidence often serves as a mask for intention. The restrictions have an effect beyond physical denial. Over decades, they create a void of first-hand accounts, a gap in photography, and a barrier to exploration. Without fresh evidence, the story of the lost city becomes easier to dismiss as folklore. Yet the boundaries remain unchanging, as if the threat of discovery is still real. Occasionally, fragments slip through a blurred image that should have been sharp. A hiker's long lens shot of an oddly symmetrical opening high in a cliff wall. Later removed from public forums, a pilot's offhand comment about unusual structures glimpsed from the air. These glimpses do not prove anything on their own, but together they trace the faint outline of something concealed in the language of secrets. Access denial is as telling as any admission. When a place is wrapped in this kind of control, it speaks to a value beyond scenery. The Grand Canyon holds countless marvels open to the world, yet here, in this tightly held corner, it holds something that cannot be shared, that something may still be there, sealed behind steel, stone, and a weight of official silence. And while the rest of the canyon stands in the sunlight, this place remains in shadow, the shadow where history itself is kept, away from the hands that might one day set it free. Imagine standing before the entrance, a slab of stone set into the canyon wall, weathered by 1,000 years of wind, but still defiant, still sealed. Your hands rest on its cold surface, feeling the faint vibration of time itself. Pressing back the air is different here, still and heavy, as if holding its breath for the first breach. The moment the barrier shifts, a breath of ancient air escapes, dry, warm, and carrying the ghost of something long forgotten. A beam of light cuts into the darkness, and for the first time since before recorded history, human eyes fall upon the truth. Inside, the walls are not rough-hewn like a miner's tunnel, but cut with impossible precision. Angles sharp enough to slice shadow dust lies thick across the floor, undisturbed for millennia, yet the symmetry is undeniable, a corridor designed for purpose, not chance. As you move deeper, the silence grows heavier, until it feels like sound itself has been left behind. A chamber opens before you. Stone columns rise into blackness, their surfaces carved with symbols that do not belong to the known languages of the Americas. Some echo Egyptian lines, others hint at Asian motifs, but most belong to neither, a script from a culture that may have touched both yet been born of neither. In the corners, the shapes of objects lie half buried in dust, vessels, tools, fragments of gold leaf catching the faint light like trapped embers. Perhaps there are human forms, here wrapped in linen turned brittle with age, features preserved enough to show that they were not the ancestors we expected. Or perhaps there are no bodies at all, only the artifacts of a people who vanished without leaving their bones behind. And then, deeper still, the architecture changes. Hallways curve into spirals, rooms align perfectly with the solstice light that has not touched them in 10,000 years. A design so advanced that even with modern tools, replicating it would take years. This is not the work of wandering tribes or chance encounters. This is the fingerprint of an organized, intelligent, and enduring civilization. If such a place exists, opening it would shatter more than stone. It would rip through history's accepted timeline, pulling apart the stories we were taught in classrooms and museums. The discovery would not just be archaeological. It would be political, economic, even spiritual. Religions might scramble to fit it into their narratives. Nations could fight for ownership, and somewhere in that chaos, the truth might still slip away. But what if just for a moment, the truth made it to us intact? What if photographs, videos, and artifacts emerged into the public eye before anyone could lock them away? Would the world celebrate? Or would it panic, realizing that if this chapter of history could be hidden for over a century, then what else has been erased? And so we are left with a thought that lingers long after the canyon winds fall silent. Maybe the greatest archaeological treasure in North America is still sitting in the dark, sealed away beneath stone and law, and maybe even now, Someone is making sure you never see it. The Grand Canyon holds its secrets well. For over a century, whispers have drifted through its canyons, stories of sealed doors, vanished expeditions, and maps that lead to nowhere. We've followed those whispers deep into the shadows, but this is only one story. There are more. Much more somewhere out there, in deserts, jungles, and frozen tundras. Other pieces of our forgotten past are waiting, and when we find them, you'll see them here first.